Good afternoon. My name is Michael Gorey, and I'm President and CEO of the Mining Association of British Columbia, and I'm coming to you live from Oboy Studios on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples. We're now in our third week celebrating Mining Month in British Columbia, along with MABC's 120th anniversary. 2 weeks ago, we discussed diversity and inclusion in mining, and last week we covered environmental innovation and decarbonization in our industry. We conclude our Innovation and ESG panel series today with a conversation about Indigenous peoples in mining. This is an important discussion for our industry to be having, and we've assembled a great panel to do so. BC's mining sector has taken a leadership role in advancing economic reconciliation with Indigenous peoples through numerous agreements, partnerships, and collaborative efforts that reflect UNDRIP principles. We're proud that Canada's mining companies are the largest employers of Indigenous peoples. At the Bruce Jack and Red Chris mines in the Northwest, for example, the workforce is over 29% Indigenous. Further, our members have become significant partners with Indigenous businesses to the tune of $265 million in 2018. We're among the few sectors that have supported Indigenous nations in undertaking their own environmental assessments on major projects, and mining was the first sector that the province entered into resource revenue sharing agreements with Indigenous nations. However, we also need to acknowledge that there's a lot more progress that needs to be made. Despite encouraging advances, we can all agree that the status quo wasn't working. As an industry, we're optimistic about moving forward together as the declaration is implemented in British Columbia and soon across Canada. With that, I'd like to welcome Julie Rachinski to make some introductory remarks on today's discussion. Julie is Manager of Human Resources and Community for New Gold's New Afton Mine, which is just south of Kamloops. Julie?
Thank you, Michael. I'd like to acknowledge that New Gold New Afton Mine is located within the unceded traditional lands of the Secwepemc Nation. We appreciate the partnerships that we have with the Kamloops to Secwepemc Nation and the opportunity to work together on the traditional territory. I'm an avid trail runner in the local area, and I want to express gratitude for the opportunity to connect with the land through my runs, and I join you today from this beautiful territory. I'm pleased to be here today introducing the Indigenous People in Mining panel. New Gold is a proud sponsor of MABC Mining Month, and we understand the importance of collaboration across our industry and the value of meaningful relationships with Indigenous peoples. New Gold's New Afton Mine understands the significance of the relationship with our Indigenous partners, and we strive to strengthen this. And this is demonstrated in our long-standing relationship with the Kamloops to Secwepemc Nation. So on behalf of New Gold New Afton and our partners, please enjoy today's panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. As we transition to the panel portion of today's meeting, I'd just like to remind you that if you'd like to ask a question, please do so using the Slido widget you should see on your screen to the right of the video feed. I'd now like to introduce our moderator for today, Dave Nikolejsin. Many of you will know Dave. He's a strategic advisor for McCarthy Tetrault, located in British Columbia. Dave previously served the BC government as Deputy Minister responsible for mining, BC Hydro, independent power producers, oil, natural gas, and pipeline affairs for 7 years. He's widely considered to be a global leader in environmental, social, and governance issues, having worked extensively with governments, industry, and environmental organizations on ESG matters and performance. Dave, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction and the welcome. And just like to start by saying I'm coming to you today from my home office in Victoria, which is traditional territory of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples. We're going to get into the topic today in a moment, and I'll turn it over to my panelists. And as I do so, each of you can just quickly introduce yourselves as well, just who you are without reading your whole bios. And then we'll get into some questions and answers, and I really would encourage people to go ahead and start thinking of what those questions might be now. I'll maybe just set the stage, first of all, from my perspective. And as Michael mentioned, I have a long history in the space. And if you think back on this question of Indigenous peoples in mining, I'm always reminded, especially by my good Tahltan friends, that Indigenous people have been mining for thousands of years. It's really what we're talking about is the recent advent of industrial scale mining on their traditional territories. And that is a more recent event for First Nations. And if you look at the history of that, it hasn't been great. And, initial developments were done, in many cases without them knowing about it, certainly without their consent or involvement. And that changed really, or started to change during the repatriation of our Constitution. And from there, all of the various court battles and challenges that First Nations took on in order to assert their rights and their titles and basically get their foot in that door. Since then, we have come a long ways. Michael talked about it in his opening. We're doing much better than if you look at that historical standard, but it's a long ways from good enough or what it probably does need to look at going forward. We're in this place now today where it's a given that those rights and titles exist. The consultative process is established. In many cases, there's revenue sharing. First Nations have development corps doing work, and that's good. It's much better. But I would say, and my theory is, and maybe just like to start the conversation by saying, I actually think mining's best days in British Columbia are actually ahead of us. And I think the focus on ESG is critically important to that perspective. The E in ESG, the carbon intensity, global warming debate, climate change sucks up all the oxygen when you talk about ESG, but I think the S and the G are becoming more and more important, and I predict a couple of years from now or going forward, we're going to hear just as much time in boardrooms and annual general meetings spent on how are you treating the local Indigenous population where you are operating? Are they involved? Is this being done at their expense or in partnership with them? Tell us about the actual sharing of benefits in a way that works for them. And the participation of Indigenous peoples in projects could look very different going forward because of that. So I think BC has the right companies, the right mojo. We've always had good geology. We're a good rule of law jurisdiction. And if you add on the future, as I think we could build it together with progressive companies who want to do the right things for the right reasons, with First Nations who are really now interested in a different kind of bargain around how developments will look going forward and what their participation will actually be, I say our best days are in front of us. So maybe with that, I'll toss it over to the panel, and maybe I'll start with you, Mark. What's your reaction to that, and what do you think?
Well, thank you. My name is Mark Podlasley. I'm a member of the Intleka'pam First Nation, which is in south central BC, about 400 kilometers east of Vancouver. I think mining going forward has been progressive over the past decade or so. What's happened is you're starting to see more Indigenous people becoming involved directly in the operations of these mines, and increasingly the benefits that come from procurement deals, subcontracting. But you're right, there's a long way to go yet. ESG, you mentioned, is a standard. It's interesting is that the coalition, I'm the director of economic policy at the Major Projects Coalition, we ran a conference in March on ESG sustainability standards, which basically dictate how investment will come into these major projects. And what was interesting about that is the worldwide ESG standards exclude Indigenous people and their interests. So there's a real need at this point to make those interests material to the investors who are looking at BC as a jurisdiction and looking at new mining projects. So you're right, Dave, in terms of what BC's got, rule of law, we have UNDRIP, the declaration that's coming into is in force here, is coming in nationally. And we have these agreements right now of revenue sharing between the provincial government and Indigenous peoples. I do agree that the future is bright, provided that mining companies include Indigenous people in all operations, at all levels of their operations, not just in terms of in the mine site, but at the governance level as well. Decisions that are made at the governance table will impact everything that goes forward in the mine sites to Indigenous people on the ground. And that's the next step for Indigenous people, to become much more involved in the decision-making and operation of mines at that senior level.
We'll have to come back to that, I think, and poke at that a bit. Nilayne, what are your initial thoughts?
Thank you, Dave. My name is Nilayne Moore, and I'm a member of the Tahltan Nation. Currently hold the role of the lands director for the Tahltan central government. I've been working in the mining industry, both directly for industry as well as for most of my career. With a background in metallurgical engineering from UBC, my goal as an Indigenous person, as a member of that nation, was to see change in the mining industry. And I've been fortunate in the work that I've been doing, both with industry and with the Tahltan government and other Indigenous governments. And yes, change doesn't happen overnight, but I've certainly seen, a progression in the work that we've been doing. And so for me, in my central government, my focus primarily is around, seeing recognition of the role of Indigenous governments in the mining industry and in decision making, right? So absolutely, with yourself and with Mark, that we need to further define what the role is for Indigenous peoples in the mining industry. So for us, we, through our impact benefit agreements, as well as our work through the Tahltan central government, we see roles for members of our nation across the mining sector, across the mine, as well as now developing, a clear role for us in the project planning for a mine as well. Now, that being said, we still are working through and developing capacity to meet these goals that we've established for ourselves. And, we're succeeding in the work we're doing. Thank you.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Justin, you want to add your thoughts, please?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. I'm going to borrow a note from a conversation we had with Mark a little earlier and say that, ESG should probably go the other way. GSE, governance first, then social, then environmental. And I agree with you, Dave, that our best days are potentially ahead of us. It really is incumbent on the mineral development industry to seize that opportunity. And if you put the G first, that is the governance first, and you incorporate values into your governance structure that support the Indigenous people and the S part of the GSE, that we can really make some huge strides here. One of the values that I really encourage is courage. I think there's a tendency in our industry on the technical innovation side, we call it the race to be second, which is, you wait for somebody else to innovate, you see how it works, and then you take the leap yourself. And on the subject of working with Indigenous people, I would encourage that we need to have courage and move forward. And make those innovations ourselves. Don't wait for somebody else to try on something new. Go ahead and innovate. Try it yourself. If there's a suggestion or an idea in your conversations with Indigenous nations, don't look around you and see what everybody else is doing and sort of wait for somebody else to try it out. Go ahead and do it. Just see what happens. Most of the time, it's good stuff. So. Yeah, thanks.
Very interesting. Yeah, very, very good advice. I think a lot of that is easy to agree with. Like, what's not to agree with, honestly, as far as trying to do better in this space? I think a lot of people are tuning in going, we get it. We signed up. We're ready to try to do better. What does that actually look like on the ground? So can you guys give some good advice to people who are listening? So, okay, we already signed up. We want to be part of the solution. We like the Indigenous inclusion angle. We're for that. How do we proceed? What does that look like on the ground as far as good advice from this panel to people who are trying to find a way forward? So why don't we maybe start with Nilayne this time? Sorry, Nilayne, I'll give you 5. So Justin, I'm building off kind of what you said. So why don't you go first, and we'll give Nilayne a sec to gather her thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. One of the more sort of controversial, I guess, or critical things for a company to think about and to bring on board in your anticipation of solutions is, what if the answer is no? You have to be prepared to hear that. And you have to know and understand what it is that you're going to do if that is the case. I think there's a real tendency in the industry to not take no for an answer, to keep trying to get to yes, to keep pushing the conversation, all kinds of strategies to try to move it there. But, you have to be prepared for that and understand what you're going to do when that is the answer. And be prepared to respect that answer. So that's as a piece of advice for projects on the ground, think about what you're going to do if the answer is no.
Yeah, that's a tough one, and I got asked a similar question, on another panel. Like, part of, if you're up for this and if you're sincere, you have to understand sometimes the answer is going to be no, and that's pretty hard for boards of directors who are looking at technical and financial things to hear, but I think it's a very, very good piece of advice. So Nilayne, go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, just to pick up on your question and Justin's comments, I think the days of trying to convince nations, Indigenous nations, that your mine is a positive thing for them or should be allowed to go ahead, I think are over. I think it's important to again respect that no might be an answer, but also be prepared to hear why. Right. So I remember, like, years ago, there wasn't a definition to, you are impacting my rights and title, to today, where, that simply isn't the case. Nations today are very prepared to talk about the importance of their values, the importance of their rights and interests, and how your proposed project might impact those very important values. So it's important to recognize that in a lot of situations, it's really going to be about dialogue. It's really going to be about transparency and sharing information. And I think today the idea of just introducing the term or the concept of value is starting to evolve as well, where nations now are applying decision-making processes that support their position. And so what I'm seeing, is much more of an integration of, Indigenous values, Indigenous rights and interests in the decision-making processes for projects, for project planning. Thank you.
Very good. And, Mark, I know you've done lots of thinking around this question of what is value? How do you define value, and how does risk play into value assessments? And what looks like added risk actually is maybe the reverse sometimes. So can you just build on what Nilayne was talking about there?
Yes, by all means. I know the discussion has been raised about accepting a no, but Nilayne's right. You have to listen to why. Because a lot of the knowledge that Indigenous people have comes from the land, comes from that territory, comes from the impact that that project will have on the environment that goes many times well beyond the science that the mining company might be using. So a no, if, or no, but, can actually improve a project. And one of the things that we were looking at the Major Projects Coalition is, how do you actually reduce the risk of these projects to enhance the ability of financiers to put money into them? So traditional knowledge and a stall or a slowdown, or at least listening to what is on the ground, will impact that risk. So Indigenous people are not against all mining. I think I could safely say Indigenous people are against mining that does not include their values or has something in it for them. Is there skin in the game that the Indigenous people are hosting these things? Because major projects, major mines will be around forever. Once the pit is in, it's there, and we will be hosting that well after the mine goes through closure. So the whole process of listening, engaging, and including Indigenous knowledge upfront in the planning, in front of the strategy, and in the whole process of raising capital will reduce that risk and make the project better.
That's great. Thank you all. I'm going to pivot to, there's a question coming in about the declaration, UNDRIP. We all hear a lot about UNDRIP. We all tend to focus on one part of UNDRIP, which is FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent. And I guess the real question is, as asked here, is UNDRIP and what the BC government did with its DRIPA legislation helping or hindering? And I have a view on that as well, but I'll let the panelists weigh in. So go ahead, Mark. Keep going.
Thank you, Dave. Right off, I think it's going to help, because what it does, it clarifies the rules of engagement much better than anything that has come forward before. The terms in UNDRIP 46 clauses very much set a standard that everybody knows where they sit and where they're coming into this. The other thing that it does help in terms of collaboration is worldwide. This is a declaration that's going to be implemented in different jurisdictions everywhere. So if you're an international mining company operating in Canada and in South America, you'll have a very clear sense of where your responsibilities are. And it sets out for Indigenous people very clearly where their responsibilities and engagement becomes in effect. The thing about UNDRIP to remember is that it is the beginning point of a discussion. It's not very long if you read it. And it's meant in some ways to be adapted for local jurisdictions, for local Indigenous people and local companies to figure out how they will engage together. So from my perspective, it actually helps projects because it gives clarification and reduces some of the uncertainty that has come from negotiations and discussions so far.
Thanks. Nilayne, what do you think? Help or hindrance?
Certainly help. And just building off, Mark's statement, just getting into some of the more specific details. When I read the UNDRIP or UNDRIP, those principles that are identified there are things that we grew up with. Right. So what I think it does for me as an Indigenous person working in the mining industry is it further strengthens my voice, my conviction. Right. So when I say, based on the input and the feedback from my nation that, a proposed development has some, significant issues or concerns with respects to water management or, potential impacts to wildlife, right? I can always go back to, the fact that we as Indigenous peoples who have never surrendered our rights and, never surrendered our lands can say with conviction, listen, we want to make sure that our lands are being properly stewarded, are being properly, considered for future generations. And, our laws now are recognizing the fact that we actually have that role that we've always known that we've had, right?
Mm-hmm. So I tend to agree that overall it's a help, but let's dig into it a bit. When you get into trying to enshrine all of this in actual, laws and legislative statutory things, this issue of FPIC keeps coming up, and vetoes and not, and what does consent actually mean and look like to you guys? And so Nilayne, keep going. Like, what does free, prior, and informed consent mean? Does it mean 100% of the Tahltan people have to agree all the time?
Well, when I consider the application of free, prior, and informed consent, I break it down by each part of FPIC, right? So I look at, the ability to freely share information with the nation to make sure that the nation is well informed, have an opportunity to provide input and ensure that their input is being taken into consideration in a project. to ensure that we are getting to a place where there is agreement, where there is consent amongst parties, right? So when we build our, our engagement, our participation processes, and in fact, we're actually starting to utilize the word participation much more than just communications, much more than engagement, because we want to make sure that our people are part of the decision-making processes, that their input is, taken into consideration and becomes part of the work that we do, right? So for me, it isn't just about veto. And maybe, at the end of the day, after consideration of all of the benefits and all of the impacts, maybe at the end of the day, there is an takes us to a no decision. But, when I look at some of the projects, some of the mining projects that we've had in our territory or that we currently have in our territory, initially from the outset, a lot of these projects, they were not agreed to. But when we applied, free, prior, and informed consent principles, we got to a place where our nation was coming together, right? And when I think about, some of the votes that we have in our participation agreements, impact benefit agreements, we're at where, we put that vote out to the nation. We have very healthy support from the nation. And just in the introduction to this panel, right, we were talking about the fact that, Red Chris, which is in Tahltan territory, has 29% of the employees being, Tahltan and other nations, right? So I see that as being a win.
Yeah, definitely something to be proud of. So I'm going to come back, Justin, and ask you the company view on FPIC in a second. Mark, keep going with your views from an Indigenous perspective of my question.
So what I find interesting about the debate around UNDRIP is it always seems to get hung up on this FPIC question, which, FPIC, you could call it the F-bomb, right? It tends to derail everybody to a discussion about the entire declaration. It's 46 clauses that touch everything from culture to environment to community. It touches everything. And the debate always comes down to FPIC. The one thing about FPIC is, and you raised it there at the beginning, what do you do when everybody doesn't come along? What happens when there's no unity across the board 100%? To ask Indigenous people to have 100% unity is like us coming back and saying, "Whoa, everybody agrees in Canada, all the provinces and federal government, every decision's made, right? That's the way we do it in Canada." But that's not true. Canada is about disagreements, and somehow we get through it. So from an Indigenous perspective, yes, FPIC is about greater involvement in the decisions, to have consent, and we are working on the definition of what that means. But there will never be 100% consent on any decision in this country. It's just the Canadian way. So how do you get past that? I should point out that in some cases, and it may be in mining, but it's certainly happening in the energy sector and sort of in the green energy sector particularly, is if you as a proponent have Indigenous partners at the equity level, they have effectively become co-proponents. And a co-proponent then, by all definition, has given consent. So that is one way that we would propose from Indigenous people that the mining companies look at that. Is there a way to get Indigenous people involved, voluntarily of course, in a project to the point where they become co-proponents? That will take care of a lot of those issues. In terms of unity among Indigenous people with Indigenous nations, perhaps there's groups within there who are not disagreeing. Indigenous people are well aware that this is an issue and are working on it. One thing I want to point out, which you referenced in a previous question about UNDRIP, is it provides certainty and make it easier or not. Many Indigenous peoples now are starting to reframe their statements of environmental, cultural values in terms of UNDRIP language to make it more powerful and consistent in dealing with government and industry. So this is a very fluid discussion. I know I have not touched on exactly what you're asking for. What do you do when there's not 100% consent among an internal First Nation issue? But First Nations are working on that. And as Canadians, this is how we have all done things. We'll work on it. We'll get there.
Excellent. some food for another question there as well. But before we go there, Justin, what do you think about from a corporate perspective? How does Skeena think about this? But you can feel free to speak into your experience talking to other corporate players as well.
I know that it's an issue of certainty, and it's a concern for a lot of companies. I think from our experience and the way that we approach it is, you can let the lawyers sort of tease that stuff apart, right? What is free, prior, and informed consent and all the rest? Practically and pragmatically on the ground, can you really advance a project in British Columbia or in Canada these days without the support of the Indigenous nation that is hosting your project? That would be pretty difficult to do. So you can argue about whether or not FPIC and DRIPA and UNDRIP means a veto, and you can have those debates in the boardroom or over the Zoom call these days. But fundamentally on the ground and practically, it's kind of semantics as far as I'm concerned. In terms of the implementation of DRIPA and UNDRIP, and I have to agree with most of the panel's discussion about it bringing more certainty over the long term. I think that in the short term right now, there's a lot of unknowns around the implementation of DRIPA in BC, and unknowns about what that's going to mean across Canada, and that's going to get people a little bit sitting on the sidelines, waiting to see what the outcomes are. And I would say to that, this is an opportunity to, as the mining industry has done a lot in its history, an opportunity to blaze a trail where there is uncertainty and where you are unsure. Don't be in the race to be second. You have an opportunity to shape what this looks like now. So jump in there and put your best foot forward. Acknowledge that Indigenous people have rights and title on their lands. They have decision-making authority in their lands, and embrace it. And you'll get to the certainty that you're seeking. Just on the outset, it might look a little bit less uncertain, but that's what we're good at as miners, right? You take something that's unknown and dive in and explore, find your way.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for all your comments on that. And I said I had a few of my own. Having been a deputy minister when DRIPA legislation was going through, I'll tell you, it took a lot of courage by the provincial government of BC to take the leap to do that legislation, because by definition, it's full of unknowns. It set the stage for all the other statutes in BC to be run through the UNDRIP lens and say, what are we going to do about this, based on the foundation that is that DRIPA Act. And I can tell you, it is a leap of faith that well-meaning companies, well-meaning bureaucrats, well-meaning First Nations, well-meaning, based on a absolute foundation of sincerity on the topic, are going to get through all that messiness. And there's a lot of messiness to come. So buckle up as, government unpacks all its statutes and runs them through that lens. Having said that, I think this is why I'm so bullish on kind of BC generally, mining generally, and what I know about this topic in this space, because I think we're up for it. There will be difficulty. Not every company is a good actor. Not every First Nation's interested in cooperative relationships or industrial development, whatever. So, lots of people are going to try to drag us down, but there's more of us that want this to succeed, and that's why I'm so bullish. So let's pivot to how that could look. And a couple of you have raised this issue of, different types of partnerships going forward. So what would it look like and what might a future look like where Indigenous folks are co-proponents, equity owners, true proponents of projects in full partnership, as opposed to just getting, benefit agreements or those types of things. And what's your vision for that, each of you, and what that might look like, and how that could, again, take BC to the forefront in showing the whole world how this could look going forward. So I'll just open it up if anyone wants to actually have first thoughts on that, but I will ask each of you.
Mining itself has the potential to be a developmental engine for a region, for an area, my community has a mine. We have a large mine. We had mining for 50 years now. The problem with the mines that they've done in the past is they're very extractive, and not just of the resource, but of any financial and economic opportunities. Those opportunities and resources flow to head offices somewhere else. They flow to people in urban centers, but the Indigenous people who host them don't get the benefits directly. So there is a move worldwide to imagine these mines as developmental engines, and they can be everything from economic. There are situations happening now where some mines are putting in or sharing their data network systems with Indigenous people who don't have access to that. There's a couple proposals in BC right now. There are proposals across British Columbia and also in Ontario for First Nations to own the electrical infrastructure that provide energy to the mines on a long-term contract, to provide benefits that go way beyond what a revenue sharing deal would do. It's actually a way to build an economy. And I think we have to start looking at mines as that, not just sort of an investment for investors, but something that Indigenous people would have at the center of their economic rejuvenation or development. And to do that, you've got to know what the Indigenous people are expecting or want out of that project. It's much more of a partnership than has been done in the past. That's how this would go forward. And you're going to see that happening in different places in Canada. It is starting to happen in other places worldwide. And for BC, again, I am also bullish on the future because we have so much going for us here compared to a lot of other jurisdictions in the world. And it will take some creativity to make that happen and some courage to be not second, but first. And if we don't do it, other jurisdictions are going to do it. UNDRIP is in effect worldwide now, so there's no going back.
Mm-hmm. Right on. So, Justin, what are you thinking?
Go to Elaine. I got to compose my thoughts. Sorry.
Okay. No, that's okay. And Elaine?
Well, in the opening, they talked about, the fact that Taltan, we've been miners for thousands of years. And so our mindset is always, working towards, ensuring that Taltans play a significant role in any sort of resource development project that happens in our territory. And, I've been fortunate in my work with the Tahltan central government and even, honored to be part of the Tahltan Nation, where we just have people that, are accomplished, and are thinking about the long-term success of the nation. We also live in BC where, there is significant mineral interest, right? So 70% of the Golden Triangle is located in Tahltan territory. We've had a number of, mining operations that have come and go through Tahltan territory. And right now, we have some pretty significant, mines that, are looking long-term into the future. We also have interest, in our territory from a number of significant mining companies as well. So I think based on our experience, based on our history, based on our interest to see our nation move ahead and excel, develop, we are in an excellent position to ensure that, we have a significant voice in proposed mining project developments in our territory moving forward. Even on the government to government side of things, the Tahltan have negotiated and implemented, advanced government to government agreements. And one in particular that we have is one for the Red Chris mine called the Red Chris Management Agreement. And even within that agreement, it speaks to things like joint inspections, it speaks to audits, right? So we are thinking long term. And within our impact benefit agreements, we've identified a number of different employment opportunities within the mining project, within the mine, but also for these positions, the opportunity to advance, right? So we're focusing on development, we're focusing on stronger governance, we're focusing on collaboration. So we're building up our nation to, in fact, be a significant part of any development activity that takes place in Tahltan territory.
Thanks. So, Justin, I'm going to add even an added degree of difficulty to your answer because it's too easy for you to just agree with that. Like, again, what's not to like? But for First Nations for companies that are being approached and want to try to take that next step in partnership with nations around things like equity involvement, how does that work? I mean, Skeena is a public company. You can't just give away equity, but on the other hand, the First Nations don't have millions of dollars laying around to buy stock. How's that work? What do you do? How can that change?
How can that change? Well, geez, I had my thoughts all composed around what Mark and Naylene were saying. And
Feel free to give both answers.
Vamp on that a little bit. So I'll go to something that Mark was saying about mining projects being an economic engine. I have a similar analogy in thinking of them as foundational projects, and by a foundation, it's something that you can stack a structure on top of. It creates a base on which a lot of other things can be done. And then, in part, connected to some of the comments that Naylene was making, there is an opportunity at all stages as you're developing a mine, during exploration, during the mine operations, closure, reclamation, and all the rest, for these things to provide that foundation for many, many other things other than just, mining. There is an opportunity to create a community between Indigenous communities and the mining community, where, if you're, I grew up in a rural area. Everybody was farmers and we're spread out all over the place. Not a lot of infrastructure, pretty remote. So you're really reliant on your neighbors a lot, and everybody's got to get along and go along. And that's what I think the opportunity is here, is that you have an opportunity to do good things for your neighbor, and they have an opportunity to do good things for you. And if you're relying on each other, like truly relying on each other, then you're going to, you're both going to realize value from being good neighbors to each other. So that's kind of a part of the value system to incorporate. In terms of, the issues of equity participation, look, we've got to be creative around that. And there's a lot of pretty good examples out there. I think there's some really genius work being done with the Tahltan Nation right now in terms of creating these equity positions in different types of operations, not just in mining companies. But there is going, when a mine is in operation, there is going to be value that is generated through your impact benefit agreement and through resource revenue sharing and those sorts of things. So it's a little bit like looking to that future cash value, and if everybody is equally certain about what that means, then that is something that you can take to the bank, I suppose, in terms of creating equity positions earlier in different stages of the project. So I hope that's helpful.
Thanks. And I don't know, Mark or Delaney, if you want to jump on my last question there real quickly before we knock off some of these other ones. Go ahead.
Okay, so the way you framed that, I would take issue with. Mining companies can't be giving away equity, and First Nations don't have piles of money around to invest. Yes and no, because the question on equity here is First Nations are not all First Nations, and I don't speak for all First Nations. I can speak for my nation and also the Major Projects Coalition, which I'm representing today. What's happening now is you're seeing Indigenous people wanting to become investors in projects that provide long-term revenue streams. First Nations will use that for their own purposes. That falls under self-determination, which is in Article 4 of UNDRIP, and DRIP addresses that. So that's the challenge. And I agree with the comment that there needs to be some creativity here. The number one challenge Indigenous people have in investing in major projects that are revenue producing long-term is access to capital. There are smaller examples and innovative public policy decisions that are happening across the country. There's innovation coming from different companies to assist First Nations find that seed capital to get in the game. But that's the challenge. And now Moody's investor group or investor service, which is in Toronto, which gives basically bond ratings or ratings to companies to raise capital, has started to compile lists of those companies that are making this creative attempt. They're compiling lists of communities across the country starting to make investment in different projects. Mining is a tougher one to actually take an equity position in because it's market-based pricing. We don't know what the price of copper or gold is going to be 10, 15, 20 years from now. It's easier in the regulated industries like electricity or in power generation or those sorts of questions or pipelines. But the innovation is happening, and it's happening for Indigenous people to become investors in projects. That's the challenge for the mining industry. How do you make that happen? If it's a big mine, like we're talking like $4 billion in capital, that's going to be a tougher thing to work out. However, as was mentioned there earlier, is that there are other businesses. So Taltan are doing it in some ways. So you have equity positions in support industries. I mentioned it in terms of providing services to a mining company or mining that'll be a long-term anchor client. You're starting to see those sorts of things happen. So comparative analysis, look at what other sectors are doing. How does it impact the Indigenous people with your project? And I'm speaking to proponents. And how do you benefit from that knowledge?
Right on. Very good and excellent advice, and thanks. Let's try to knock off some of these other questions that have come in our last 10 minutes here. So any advice for the provincial government on how they could contribute in a greater way to reconciliation and certainty? Yeah, anyone can just go ahead.
I said my piece, access to capital for Indigenous people to become true partners in these operations and then truly reap the benefits of what is coming from unceded territories. So that means Indigenous sovereign loan guarantees, perhaps. It could be green bonds. These are things that are starting to be done in other jurisdictions. I would recommend that for having the provincial government to get in, to help Indigenous people get in the game, to benefit companies, to benefit the economy, to benefit all people of BC.
Yeah, I think that's such good advice because and again, having been there on the inside, it's such a catch-22. Such a catch-22. It takes money to make money. Nilaine, thoughts? Advice?
I think it's really important for government to understand that Indigenous governments have a role in the decision-making process, and that the Indigenous government's process or their internal work that they do to get to a decision is theirs, and they design it. And I think it needs to be respected as such, right? So when it comes to, decision making, notices of work or expiration activity or any of the likes, there are going to be times where Indigenous governments or nations are going to disagree with the proposed activity. And I think that disagreement needs to be recognized. It needs to be acknowledged. And there are still situations today where that doesn't happen. And I understand, currently we're under the provincial jurisdiction in a lot of the sense, but a lot of Indigenous governments don't believe that, right? And so I think it's important that we understand and respect that there are two governments here that are trying to make a decision.
Great point. Justin, speaking on behalf of the global mining industry, what advice do you have for the provincial government?
I don't know if I can speak on behalf of the global mining industry, but I'll do my best. Those are pretty scary words in the private sector. I'm with government and I'm here to help. No offense, Dave. I think it's very, very important to recognize that there is a tremendous amount of diversity in Indigenous nations and in projects and in circumstances all across the province and all across the country. And one of the things that governments can do to help is recognize when good things are happening and stand by to help and talk to the parties that are involved, that is the company and the Indigenous nation, about solutions for that particular circumstance, for that particular project and that particular nation. the approach of blanket policies or blanket approaches to things can really complicate stuff because it makes it very difficult to customize to the situation at hand. But I think it's very, very important to initially, from the government side, to evaluate what is happening between the parties that are discussing the project, and ultimately stand by to help, but take advice from those parties instead of trying to impose solutions that are supposedly good for everybody. They may not be good in that particular circumstance. So,
super good advice, and I can really validate it that where trouble usually starts is when you try to ask the question inside the government, well, what do the First Nations think? And try to have a singular answer to that when you're developing policies or other ideas. So I think that notion of locality, because what people think depends on who they are and the situation and the project and lots of other things. So good advice. We have about 5 minutes left, so literally just 1 or 2 minutes from each of you. Closing comments, and going back to the question that's been up for a long time, if you have one word that you could leave people with, what would it be? So I'll maybe go in reverse order from how we started. So Justin, you want to go first?
I'll go back to my initial answer: courage. Use that. As we move into this new space and place, there's going to be ideas floating around or initiatives proposed that have never been done before, are completely new. Have courage. Go ahead and take that step. Examine the idea. If it seems like it's going to work for you, for your project, for your nation, go ahead and take that step. I think that's key. Don't be in the race to be second. Be first.
Excellent. Elaine.
I think my word to add to today's talk is change. Right? We're changing constantly. And I think at the end of the day, as we continue to accept and embrace change, we are going to have a better industry. We're going to have a stronger industry in the province of BC because we are working together to try to be inclusive, right? To try to ensure that it really just isn't about the science or Western science anymore, that there are other values that need to be taken into consideration. So my word for today is change.
Excellent. Mark, last word to you, and then we'll close.
The word I'm going to leave you with, which doesn't come up often, is epistemology. Epistemology in its simplest form is, why do you think the way you do? Where does your common sense come from? What is the values that drives your actions? Because what happens is a lot of the times the conflict between Indigenous people and proponents, especially around mining, comes from the sense of this is the way things are done, and both sides become entrenched. So that's what I leave you with. Why do you think the way that you do? And why do you think it's right? It's epistemology.
Yeah. Very, very profound, actually. Thanks for that. So with that, we'll draw this to a close. Our time is up. So thank you, panelists, for your very, very insightful comments and for validating my initial proposition that our best days are in front of us, which is what I took away from this session today. And so thank you very much. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Michael. Hopefully you're still there somewhere.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you, panelists. That was a great panel. Courage, change, epistemology. Those are all great words. And I would also add in trust and how important it is for industry on our part to move from a kind of a transactional footing to one where we put investment and time into building relations, getting to know people, and building trust. Because that's really foundational to everything else that we're trying to do to achieve, shared objectives and build shared prosperity between Indigenous peoples and our industry. And I certainly agree. I do believe with Dave and what all the panelists said in terms of I think our best days are ahead. in BC's mining industry. So with that, I'd like to thank Dave, Justin, Nelaine, Mark, and Julie for taking the time to join us today. And as a thank you to each of our speakers, a donation is being made to Mining for Miracles to raise funds for the Cellular and Regenerative Medicine Centre at BC Children's Hospital. This concludes our panel series on ESG and innovation, which of course was our theme for Mining Month 2021. Although our panels are complete, Mining Month still has a lot more great events to offer. Next week on Wednesday morning, PricewaterhouseCoopers will release its annual BC Mining Report. We'll see what impact COVID had on the finances and economic impact of our sector in 2020. More information on this event can be found on MABC's website. Later that day, I'll be delivering a keynote speech at the Greater Vancouver Board of Trade to provide an update on the state of the industry in BC and highlight the many opportunities that BC's mining community is looking to seize in the coming years. That will be sponsored by Teck Resources and Rio Tinto. And I hope you'll join us, and don't forget to follow our social media activity on LinkedIn or on Twitter, where our handle is at @MA_BC. Thank you again, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your week. And I also hope you have a relaxing and enjoyable long weekend. Thank you.